Level 989.
Welcome to 989 on Health, where you don't need years of university to understand the latest news about health and related subjects. As always, we've created a list of helpful links to more info on today's topic at our website, level989.com, and those same links should be visible in your podcast playing app of choice.
This podcast is an informal discussion sharing our personal viewpoints on health and wellness. Don't rely on the information in this podcast as an alternative to medical advice from a professional healthcare provider. For the full disclaimer, please see our website.
I'm Mike Davalos, just a guy, your average Joe, and I'm joined by the opposite of average, Brandon Weintraub, a primary care physician. Good morning, Brandon.
Good morning, Mike.
Our topic for today is high-tech body modification. This might be an odd way to start this episode, but while I was pretty excited by the possibilities when I started out researching this, a couple of hours of reading later had me kind of bummed out.
What do you mean? Were the gadgets too expensive? Or not enough gears and steam valves for your taste? What's got you so upset about body modifications?
Well, it turns out there's two major categories of body mods, as I'm going to refer to them going forward. There's the bleeding edge, no pun intended, medical grade variety, and this is gear like the next generation artificial limbs that are actually wired into the brain to allow not just for movement, but also for the sensation of touch. And then there's the other variety, what I'd call a body hack, which is far more low level. And me getting bummed out during the research, well, for one thing, it became clear that there's a lot less of the actually real, you can get it now, of both varieties than it feels like there should be as a gadget enthusiast. What with all these amazing stories you read on what seems like a daily basis. As we mentioned in our episode about the future in medicine, there are far more technologies that are perpetually touted as coming soon than are actually available for real. Most of the body mods that actually exist and are available are of the hack variety. And by hack, I mean, well, that's a reference to modding something, not the other definition of the term. That the work is poorly done or unprofessional. Although, let's get to the techie tech already. We should probably start off with a quick mention of wearable tech. This is the kind of stuff that's not actually implanted in your body, but stuff that you can wear as long as you like, and then remove when you like. Wearables aren't the focus for this episode, but how about you give us a quick overview?
The term wearables is an interesting one that we may as well define right off the starting line. When we talk about wearables, we're discussing any item that tags along on the body, whether it's an article of clothing, an earbud, a fitness tracker, even a box tiny enough to fit in your pocket can fit in the general category. The important thing about a wearable is that it uses technology to collect information and provide a service to its user or its wearer. Over the last few years, some of the most impressive sounding and potentially exciting wearables haven't managed much traction with the overall population. One of the projects I was most excited about was the Google Glass project. Basically a pair of glasses that you could wear, which had a screen displayed either on or through one of the lenses. And it had video and audio recording capabilities and linked with your smartphone to allow you to make calls and schedule things, all sorts of additional extras.
I never saw too much about Google Glass during the short time they were around. How would something like that be useful?
Imagine being able to have a video chat with a family member while sending an email to your manager, and all while you're sitting in your favorite restaurant, and you didn't have to lug around even a laptop-sized parcel. To me, it sounded amazing. Unfortunately, there were problems to deal with. Less than an ideal voice command system and a small screen size. There was some difficulty interfacing with applications other than those that were developed for the Glass project specifically. And it was all alongside a fairly sizable price tag. That's without mentioning the legal issues that began hounding the device as soon as it became available to beta users. Just for example, there were issues with bringing a permanently active recording device into places like testing centers, movie theaters, you name it. That's where a number of wearables find their downfall, unfortunately. They may provide a useful service or sound like a dream come true, but the legal and functional realities of even the most seemingly innocuous device create a difficult market for many wearables to find a foothold in.
You wear a fitness tracker, as I recall. I don't yet. I might someday try an Apple Watch once they're more of a standalone device with their own cellular connection. But I don't know. I really hate wearing watches and rings and stuff like that. It would have to be a pretty amazing device for me to put up with it. For actual implants in the human body, there are a few cool body hacks we can start out with. You mentioned one while we were discussing the concept for this episode a while back. Something to do with magnets implanted in fingers? Can you explain what that's all about? Why a person would do such a thing? I mean, how is it useful beyond just like a bar trick?
I'll explain as best I can, although I'll be honest, many of the body modifications I've read about seem a little extreme. And in this case, we're talking about a rare earth magnet that's implanted into one or more of your fingers. Rare earth magnets, despite their name, aren't actually rare. The name comes from the elements used to make the magnets themselves. What actually makes these magnets special is their strength and the fact that they're permanent magnets. So, you take this strong, permanent magnet and coat it with a non-reactive metal, like gold maybe, or I think titanium is preferred these days, both for surgical uses and things like piercings. And then a minor surgical procedure later, poof, you've got a magnetic finger or three. The explanation of why is still a bit hazy to me. Some of the people wanted to be able to pick up things like paper clips more easily. More frequently, though, I read about professionals working in information technology that wanted a way to detect wiring and electromagnetic fields without having to always carry around their detector kits. Apparently, and I have to say apparently because I don't have any direct experience, if you practice enough, someone with one of these magnets in their fingers can learn to feel where there is a strong and active electromagnetic field nearby. For example, when you have a live high-voltage wire behind a wall, they can find and avoid hitting these wires when they're pulling new wiring, for example. To me, it does sound like a bit of a parlor trick. You know, hey, watch me predict where there are some wires. I can pick up the screw I lost when I was taking this computer apart without needing a special tool. I do, however, understand the desire to find easier and smoother ways to get their daily tasks done. And honestly, if the concern I had about the potential risks about having a permanent earth magnet was outweighed by the benefits of what it might do, I'd consider the procedure myself.
Is this sort of procedure approved by the FDA?
I don't believe so, but I could be wrong, so don't take my word for it. To my knowledge, the FDA doesn't approve the procedure because there isn't any real regulatory committee involved just yet. At no point can you go to your physician and say, "I'd like a magnet installed in my finger, please," and expect the response, "Ah, yes, I did 4 of those last week. I'll have my staff get the insurance forms for the procedure."
Where are people getting these procedures done? I mean, I saw a passing reference to tattoo parlors and skin-piercing kiosks performing gray market procedures like this. How do you feel about that? And also, is the magnet implantation a procedure an acupuncturist could or should or would do? You've taught me a lot, but I'm still a bit hazy on what an acupuncturist's scope of practice actually is.
Right now, most people who are electing to try out this particular body modification are having to plate the earth magnets themselves, and then have body artists. Like you said, these are people who you would see about getting a professional piercing or maybe a tattoo. And those are the professionals that would actually make the installation. I'm not especially happy about people plating their own magnets for use when implanting these magnets within their bodies. It's all too easy to make a mistake, and one mistake could lead to toxicity, infection, loss of nerve sensation, a whole host of other potential problems.
I missed that during the research. The fact that you have to somehow plate the magnet in gold or titanium by yourself. I mean, that's crazy. Who can afford that? And who could or would be able to do that up to safe medical standards? I know the answer to that. Almost no one would.
Agreed. As for using body artists rather than surgeons or physicians for the procedure, well, I suppose it does all come back to your rather well-timed mention of scope of practice. Scope of practice refers to the actions a licensed practitioner of, well, anything, is or is not legally allowed to do, as described in the national or state regulation for their profession. The phrasing is often fairly vague, with the exception of the primary skills or techniques you'd see for a given profession. While acupuncturists are described as being allowed to use acupuncture needles for their treatments, the remaining language for the practice of acupuncture is left open to allow practitioners a variety of techniques without the need for description, which might also limit their functionality as a primary care physician.
And in the case of magnets or other similar basic body mods?
In the case of those seeking magnet modifications, the trick is to find a practitioner that finds implantation of these magnets is within their scope of practice, as well as to find someone willing to take the risks involved of performing such a procedure. I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that acupuncturists, at least here in Florida, do not currently find this procedure within their scope of practice, and as such should not and would not be installing magnets inside someone's finger or anywhere else. Interestingly, it appears that professional body piercers, again in the state of Florida, may technically be able to perform the procedure so long as certain standards are met when it comes to the magnet itself and how the procedure is performed. Although I'm not an expert or a lawyer, so please, I'm just guessing. What I can say for certain is that I would love for the procedures involved in this, and any other body modifications we may discuss, to be clearly defined. Who should and can do them, under what conditions they can be best performed, etc., so that people planning on trying these things out can be safely monitored and modified without undue risk to their health and well-being. Even though inserting a magnet underneath the skin might seem outrageous to most of us, those who are interested in trying something like it deserve to be as safe as possible every step of the way.
And I'm guessing that if I wanted an MRI scan, and that's where they shove you in a giant donut filled with high-powered magnets to peek inside your body and diagnose medical problems, a person would want to remove their magnetic implant first.
Definitely. You would be careful to remove all metal jewelry, piercing studs, and all that sort of thing before an MRI. There are a whole list of things that have to be taken into consideration when getting an MRI. Everything from tattoos to artificial heart valves, and certainly magnetic implants.
I've heard a number of references to magnet implantation over the past 10 years or so, but in reading a number of articles recently, the biggest negative aspect seems to be that if you have one or more magnets implanted in your body and you come into a magnetic field out in the world, and unsurprisingly in the modern world there are magnetic fields everywhere, it can cause the magnet inside you to flip. You know, the whole north repels north and south repels south property of magnetic poles, and this can cause some discomfort. I never considered the whole hurts when they flip issue before. I suppose they should use sphere-shaped magnets so they wouldn't be disturbing the tissues of your finger if and when the magnet is reorienting itself. I seem to remember that magnets are used in specific, careful ways in Chinese medicine to treat certain issues, and I'm sure there's enough to fill an entire episode on magnet treatments, but can you give us a brief overview of the use of magnets in Chinese medicine? And are they ever implanted in the body?
As a practitioner who utilizes magnets in some treatments himself, I can say that I have never once come across a style of acupuncture which inserts the magnets being used during treatment into or under the skin. For the most part, magnets, and I generally use flat magnets that have been plated in gold, the magnets are placed on specific areas of the body, often on parts of the ear, the hands or feet, occasionally on acupuncture points on the body directly. And they're kept in place with paper tape, also sometimes called surgical tape, which can be used for things like keeping medical bandages in place. If you need to take the magnet off, a little hot and soapy water dissolves the adhesive on the tape, leading to a quick and completely discomfort-free removal.
So can you share any personal thoughts you have on the positive or negative health effects of having a random magnet implanted in a random finger on a random human who may or may not have a medical need from the perspective of Chinese medicine?
That's a great question, and one that was brought up while I was in school as well. The precise mechanisms by which magnets, and frankly, acupuncture as a whole, work, it's still not adequately described or understood by the tenets of Western science. One working theory for related therapies is that needles or magnets placed in the appropriate position, say on the correct area of your hand, can create a reaction in an entirely different area of your body, similar to the way that a nerve dermatome can be used to treat and find pain.
Hold on. What's a nerve dermatome? Just real quick like.
A nerve dermatome is basically an area of skin that's supplied by a single spinal nerve. So if a symptom follows the path that one of these dermatomes takes, it's reasonable to suspect that a specific nerve root may be involved.
Thank you. As you were saying before I interrupted.
So what does it mean if someone, for example, puts a magnet in their finger or gets their ear pierced? Will that cause a permanent negative or, heck, maybe a positive reaction? Women have been getting their ears pierced for many, many years, right? And there hasn't been a horrific plague of new injuries or pain found only on those with pierced ears. So that means we're in the clear, right? I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Nothing is ever definite with Chinese medicine. For the most part, I have to say that a single magnet, or getting a piercing or two, isn't likely to cause any significant harm. However, I have seen firsthand how powerful a magnet, or an acupuncture needle, in the right place can be. The body always tries to reach homeostasis, balance, and in most cases it'll be able to work around things like piercings and surgical implants. But it's worth it to always keep possible ramifications in mind, especially when making a decision for an elective procedure.
All right, we've spent a long time on magnets, but it actually turned out to be a far more complex item than I was expecting. Which is saying something since there's no microchips or batteries or circuitry involved, just a special blend of metals. But I think we covered a lot of the information on the periphery. How legal basic body mods might be, who can do it, is it a good idea? All of that kind of applies to most implants you might consider getting. Now the next gadget on the list, do magnets count as a gadget? I'm still not sure. The next gadgets we're looking at today are RFID chips. Brandon, can you explain what an RFID chip is? And next, why would I want one implanted in my body?
Radio frequency identification, or RFID for short, uses radio waves to send information hundreds of meters from a single ID tag. These tags are used in a plethora of different ways nowadays, everything from paying for a toll on a major highway to tracking migration patterns of animals. They're usually small, light, and can be powered by something as small as a hearing aid battery. So, why would anyone want an RFID tag physically implanted? It isn't as crazy as it sounds at first. You ever lost your car keys? Spent that hour in a mad state looking everywhere and promising you'd start putting them in the same place every night so that it never happened again? Well, modern cars are actually using RFIDs, housed inside a key fob, as an integral part of the starting mechanism. So, all of those vehicles using keyless start buttons use an RF transmitter, so that once the ID tag is in range, the car will start. Implant an RFID in your arm that transmits the correct code, and voila! You never need to worry about losing your keys again. And now, more and more systems in your home and office are becoming compatible with RFID technology. Everything from door locks to light systems can be controlled by transmitting the correct information.
Seems to me that the more influence or control you have over your environment, the more likely an RFID implant would be useful to you. If you can manage to convince the head of security at your workplace to let you use your implant to open the office doors, or if you own an Android phone, since iPhones are too locked down to use RFID, or you own your own home and can afford to install RFID-friendly door locks, lamps, and other devices, or you can afford an expensive luxury car that works with RFID. There just seem to be a lot of forces working against RFID that seem to make it something for die-hard enthusiasts, but not mass market enough to worry about for another 10 or 20 years? And they were invented 40 years ago, so it's been a slow burn. Am I wrong?
The initial invention that led to modern versions of RFID technology was patented in 1973. That's true. Although I'm not sure how slow the burn has actually been for the device. Inventory tracking, scientific applications, automotive devices. There are RFID tags in more places than you might expect. Heck, the FDA has actually already approved the use of RFIDs in humans, and it's being implemented to store things like personal medical history, allergies, that sort of thing. There are other reasons why incredibly widespread use of RFIDs haven't invaded every aspect of our lives. These involve things like excess data generation and privacy implications, just to name a couple. I actually would not be terribly surprised to see RFIDs implemented on some reasonable scale before too much more time passes. Possibly along the lines of the Identi-Ease cards from one of my favorite science fiction novels, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Think personal information and identification card, all rolled into one.
One of the first instances of RFID I heard about, 10 or 15 years ago now, was that retail companies like Walmart were going to put cheap, no-battery RFID sticker on each item, on each shelf, with sensors everywhere, and they'd be able to track their inventory down to the item. Which, in today's world of just-in-time inventory control, could save a company like Walmart millions of dollars. I was going to say per year, but could be per day for all I know. From what I can tell from my research, RFID tracking has still not labeled every single pack of toilet paper or toothpicks, but that day might be coming. One surprising thing I came across with RFID was a healthcare story about human trafficking. Now, I know I lead a sheltered life, but it's hard to come to grips with the idea that something like human trafficking still exists in the 21st century. What can you tell us about this news article, which will of course be in the show notes?
Human trafficking isn't just a marginal issue, even here in the United States. The illegal and unconscionable misuse of human life is ongoing, and it's a significant problem that really does need some attention. The article in question describes an extremely unusual event. Apparently, a woman, who was admitted to the ER, was being forced by her boyfriend to sell her body. For whatever reason, the boyfriend had decided to implant an RFID chip, like the ones used for tracking pets, into this woman's side. The reasoning behind this action isn't entirely clear. Whatever his motivation, the article focused more on the most important lesson to be learned from this event. 88% of all victims of human trafficking end up being brought to medical or emergency medical facilities, which means physicians and medical personnel are in a unique position to help victims of human trafficking.
Human trafficking still seems unreal to me, something horrible from another time that shouldn't be possible in the modern world. I read an article dissecting a number of elements in the RFID and human trafficking story. And one problematic element that I see over and over again anytime RFID is mentioned is the misconception that RFID only works at very short range. You have to touch or almost touch the transmitter receiver so they, that mysterious they, can't track you with RFID. And while yes, an RFID chip is not also a GPS, the range depends quite a bit on the power of the transmitter receiver. When I'm zooming down the highway at 75 miles an hour and pass under one of Florida's many turnpike toll arches, I'm able to ping this little RFID sticker, this tiny peel and stick thing. It's on my windshield, what seems to be 100% accuracy. And the sensor arch is a good 15 to 20 feet away. Now you live in Florida, you've seen these, right?
Oh, definitely. Although the accuracy isn't anywhere near 100%, and most turnpike checkpoints are pinch points that do require you to slow to 25 miles per hour. You'll also notice that all of those toll booths that use the RFIDs also have cameras to take license plate pictures. They are, at the very least, very good at billing me each and every time.
Exactly. So if you wanted to track workers within a set of corporate buildings, you could install hidden, high-powered RFID sensors in the walls or ceilings or floors, and just with the RFID chip on their required corporate key cards, forget about implants, you could ping the cards once a minute, or any interval you please, and you'd know who's sitting diligently at their workstation and who's a lazy wanderer. You'd know who's taking an extra long trip to the break room, or who's making too many unauthorized bathroom visits, or taking more smoke breaks than they should, or even just the identity of the smokers. There's only one authorized smoking section, so it's easy to track this, which is something your corporate insurance company might find useful, to root out those people who claim to be non-smokers for cheaper insurance. So the idea that human traffickers could be using RFID to track their merchandise is a lot more plausible than it might seem at first. It might be more of an alarm will sound if any members of the forced labor coal mining team leave work zone number 2. Then where is worker 47 at this very moment? And keep in mind there can be far lower powered transmitters than you might think, and if they take advantage of pinch points like doorways, which funnel many people through a tight space. Am I making sense? What do you think?
That's more or less the scenario we have to be concerned with as it stands right now. Once you know where the RFID is, you can use it with reasonable accuracy to track point-to-point movement. However, they aren't as useful in instances where more specificity is required. For example, once an item is placed in a warehouse, movement within the warehouse, say from one shelf to the shelf below it, can't really be tracked very well unless an additional checkpoint is used. And even then, the range might be small enough that another receiver isn't going to be helpful. RFIDs would also be useless in a situation where the transmitter wasn't where it was supposed to be. In other words, if you checked a person into waiting room A, the system you're using is going to believe the transmitter is in room A until the RFID is scanned by another valid receiver. If the tag gets from one room into the outside world, that RFID has become useless unless scanned by another receiver hooked into your database. If the system was widespread enough, and there were enough receivers that scanning became second nature, well, then we've got a scenario that's pretty scary.
All this discussion was to allow me to make this point. Trying to use RFID as a security feature to unlock a door at home or at work, or unlock your car, or log into your computer, it's a bad idea. It's right up there with fingerprint security, which sounds neat, but it's messy. You leave fingerprints everywhere, all the time. And since the range of RFID depends largely on the power of the transmitter, it's not secure in the slightest. If someone manages to capture and duplicate the signal from your implanted RFID chip, they can unlock your computer, front door, or whatever else you've set up to work with RFID. It's not very likely, it's not something that should keep a person up at night, but someone using this should have the awareness that it's not secure. Thoughts?
I completely agree. More than almost any other concerns involving RFID use, it's the privacy and security aspects that leave the most to be desired. Having an RFID that lets you open and start your car is one thing, especially since capturing the unique signatures being used is still kind of tricky. However, as the technology becomes more and more integral to things like inventory tracking and the technology is further refined, using RFIDs to store personal data and to control access to secure sites and information is going to be risky, especially for the amateur. That's not to say that we need to stop using RFIDs entirely, but I do suggest the average listener avoid tinkering with it when their personal safety and information is involved.
One last bit on RFID. Since there's been a number of instances over the past few years where law enforcement has ordered a person to use their fingerprint to unlock their own phone, I could imagine I don't know if I want to say more secure after all my naysaying about RFID, but I could imagine a differently secure setup to unlock a phone. Would perhaps be with 3 or more RFID chips installed in the body, maybe one in my left arm, one in my right leg, and one in my earlobe. The correct pattern or sequence of RFID scans has to happen to unlock the phone, or perhaps just to access a set of locked file folders on the phone, and if you're being forced, you could intentionally enter the incorrect pattern and the phone would wipe itself of all data. Just a quick aside since it's been mentioned. Now, we might cover biometric security as its own episode someday, but one problem is you can't change your fingerprints if the hackers get a hold of them, which sounds like a silly thing to say, but it can happen. In Japan, it's a popular thing when you're getting your picture taken to hold up 2 fingers in the peace sign. Brandon, can you break down what's going on with the fingerprints in photos story? Should this actually be a concern?
I hadn't read this particular article until you forwarded it to me for today's podcast, but I'll do my best. Apparently, a group of researchers managed to find a way to recreate a copy of a fingerprint using a digital image, one that was taken from a full 9 feet away from the victim. Since many new phones allow the use of fingerprints in lieu of passwords, there is a viable security concern. Whether or not this is something we need to be incredibly concerned about, though, well, I'm not sure. Security analysts have known for years that fingerprint scanners are not particularly useful in terms of their safety. College students in recent years have managed to overcome fingerprint scanners using little more than tape and glue. For most users, phones possess personal information, but nothing that they would consider excessively critical in terms of their digital security. While I disagree, since every phone number stored on my phone means a friend, a relation, or a business contact now at risk due to my lack of security, the average user isn't likely to be in a situation where access to their phone via fingerprint is anything more than a nuisance. Long story short, if you want something to be secure, don't use fingerprints as a means of access.
The next type of gadget are LED lights. These are tiny light-emitting diodes with a battery attached, and they're implanted in the skin. Now, RFID, I can understand better since they're very tiny and there's some usefulness to them. What are LED implants good for?
Yeah, so LED implants are one of those biohacks that don't really have an immediate purpose. Think of them like tattoos. They can commemorate important events and look very pretty, but in the end, by and large, they don't really do anything except help someone feel like more of an individual. That's the same thing these LEDs do. Give them the signal, and they light up for a little while, illuminating the skin, and then they turn off. They don't have a function beyond the aesthetic. Much of the initial interest in these devices was actually from tattoo enthusiasts. They wanted to be able to make their tattoos light up.
I suppose that, like my RFID pattern unlock mobile phone scenario, a series of LEDs could perform a similar function. I don't really understand the scope of it, but it seems like no matter how carefully you select the alloys and plastics for implantation, over time, implanted items either degrade or they're rejected by the body. Do I have that right?
It isn't a guarantee that the body will reject an implant, but it is true that even professional surgical-grade materials break down over time. For example, think of the stories you may have heard about people who have had bone replacements that have to eventually go in for another surgery to replace something like a worn-out hip joint. Since most of the modifications we've discussed are far from top of the line, it's very likely that eventually they'll wear out and need replacing or removal.
All right, how about for our last couple of devices, some real-life, professional, approved devices for implantation? I mentioned one such device earlier, just in passing. Apparently there really are prosthetic limb replacements that you can wire into the nervous system that are so advanced they can provide the sensation of pressure, texture, touch. Is this some amazing new microchip making this possible, or is the brain itself doing the work?
It's actually a mixture of both. What makes this particular breakthrough revolutionary is that the researchers have managed to find a way to wire the prosthetic directly into the motor cortex of the brain, not only to allow the wearer to send commands to the prosthetic, but so that the artificial limb can send signals back, allowing some variety of sensation and feedback. During testing, apparently, the researchers decided to test the sensitivity of the system by touching 2 of the prosthetic fingers instead of just 1 the way they were supposed to. And the user of the prosthetic was actually able to tell them that there was a difference. He went as far as to accuse the researchers of playing a joke on him. So the device is using its hardware, as well as relying on the brain's own functions, to create something astonishing.
Another amazing real-life implant. What can you tell us about cochlear implants? I think this is one of my favorites.
I think this is probably my favorite of the surgically implanted devices we've discussed in today's podcast as well. Many people think of a cochlear implant kind of like a hearing aid, which, I hate to say, isn't really the case. Your average everyday hearing aid basically acts as a microphone and a speaker. The hearing aid just raises the volume of sounds being picked up by the microphone. A cochlear implant is an entirely different story. It consists basically of 2 parts, an external portion that sits behind the ear, and an internal portion which is surgically placed underneath the skin. A cochlear implant does use a microphone, but rather than just playing back things louder, it takes sounds that are picked up and runs them through a speech processor. Once the speech processor arranges things appropriately, the signals are sent to a receiver, which is actually connected to a special electrode array, which stimulates the auditory nerve directly. What's all the technical jargon mean? Essentially, a cochlear implant is used when portions of the ear are damaged, and regular sound transmission simply won't ever get correctly translated into sounds. By directly manipulating the auditory nerve, it's possible to give some semblance of hearing back to people who would otherwise never hear again. It's important to note that a person doesn't hear in the same way they used to before the implant. It takes time and retraining to be able to interpret the sounds transmitted by the device. But considering that most people can eventually recognize warning signals, they can interpret sounds from their environment, even eventually recognize speech in person or over the phone, this particular body modification is nothing short of extraordinary. This isn't exactly the same type of mod we've discussed for most of the podcast, but this is the direction I'd be excited to see body modification take.
Okay, here's the big question. Would you get any of the existing body mods installed in your own body? And I'll hold my own answer until you're done.
I'll answer with a little backstory. I've been interested in the idea of high-tech body modification for a number of years. Ever since I read a book called The Great Mambo Chicken and the Transhuman Condition, I've been enamored with the idea that sophisticated technologies could be used to overcome shortcomings that would otherwise hold an individual back. After I read the book, authored by Ed Regis, by the way, I did a fair amount of research into available and upcoming technologies that could make my dream into a reality. After all these years, and I'll pass on admitting exactly how many, I have to say, the field of non-medical biohacks hasn't changed at all. The same papers I read, the same modifications, with the exception of 1 or 2 news stories about someone else who got a magnet implant. There hasn't really been any advancement. So, since things haven't really changed all that much, I think I would have to admit that I would not be willing to try any of the modifications we've discussed today. The exception, of course, is the wearables category. As computer chips continue to get smaller and speeds continue to improve, some of these wearables are actually pretty neat. Nothing out there has me itching to do amateur surgery, but I could be convinced to try the latest in designer computer eyewear.
Now, I'm nowhere near as techie as you are, but I've worked around a lot of technology and tested software and tested hardware, and none of it is reliable enough for me to install in my body. I mean, hardware still breaks constantly, my phone apps are always crashing, batteries die and corrode, nothing's truly secure even with encryption. So until the day when all of these problems have been resolved, I'm not getting any implants. I agree that wearables are definitely going to be the thing for many decades to come. If I really had to pick something for implantation, it would be noise-canceling ear implants, which don't really exist. I have a very high irritation factor for a wide variety of sounds. There's actually a name for this condition. It's called misophonia. And to think all these years I just thought I was grumpy. Anyway, it would be really nice just to be able to tune it all out without wearing some big clunky wearable hardware. Is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap it up?
I hate to say it, but this podcast episode wasn't everything I had hoped it would be when I brought up the possibility a few weeks ago. I had assumed, much to my chagrin, that since it had been a number of years since I had last actively done any research into body modification projects, that modern science and technology would have come up with some exciting, if as yet unapproved, ways a person could better themselves. Instead, it turns out that, big surprise, making sudden and intense changes to the human body isn't an easy thing to do. Our bodies are complex systems, which we have come to think of as extremely ornate machines. Find the right plug and the right operating system, and it should be possible for anyone to become a product of their wildest dreams. The truth is that we don't actually understand all that much about the complex mechanisms that make up what humans are today. Modern science is trying to unlock a few mysteries, and it's doing a decent job. But in the end, there always seems to be another process, a puzzle, another enigma that needs to be deciphered. Having to accept that you can't just plug in data from a few tests, take a few pills, and have your body fix every issue it might have, it can be difficult. Especially when modern medicine can do things like remove and replace organs, or delay the progression of a fatal disease with nothing more than a few machines and a couple of pills. The fact is that there's no instantaneous fix for a great many of the things you're likely to experience. From weight loss to emotional roller coasters, there's always work to be done. Technology is there to help us reach beyond certain limitations. But in the end, all the wearables and surgeries in the world require you to be willing to put in your own efforts to adapt and improve. So keep an eye on your goals, work towards them, and hey, who knows? Maybe in a few years there will finally be that implant to expand your own personal memory or processing power. Stranger things have happened.
That's all the time we have for today. These short episodes are a brief overview of very complex topics. Everything we say is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Licensed healthcare professionals should advise you and be aware of changes you're planning to make to any aspect of your healthcare. Every person's needs are different. The links to references we've made about news articles, medical studies, or other materials can be found at level989.com, along with our contact information and the complete Don't Take Medical Advice from Podcasts disclaimer. Thanks for listening, and now go health yourself.